Bom dia, pessoal. Vamos dar início aqui às nossas atividades. Vou passar a palavra para o professor Odilon, diretor da faculdade, para a gente começar aqui nossa programação.
Bom dia, pessoal. Sejam todos bem-vindos, bem-vindas. É uma satisfação recebê-los. Antes de mais nada, quero fazer aqui um agradecimento em nome da professora Maria Luísa Tanuri Alves por esse maravilhoso evento, essa reunião de pesquisadores internacionais que muito nos honra. É uma satisfação recebê-los. Tenho certeza que vai ser um dia de um trabalho excelente. Ontem recebemos os pesquisadores lá na direção, conversamos longamente, eles estão bastante empolgados com essa possibilidade de troca com vocês. Então, minha recomendação é que desfrutem dessa oportunidade. Eu comentava aqui com a professora Maria Luísa que um evento como esse, reunindo pesquisadores de pontos tão diversos, numa mesma fala, é muito incomum no Brasil. Nós temos aqui uma oportunidade bastante grande diante de nós. Fica aqui meu agradecimento ao Departamento de Educação Física Adaptada, professor Edson, professora Malu, pelo excelente trabalho e compartilhamento desse trabalho aqui com a nossa comunidade. Quero também saudar colegas nossos que estão presentes aqui, de várias faculdades, da USP, do Amazonas, né, você me disse, de Roraima, né, Santa Catarina. Sejam todos sempre bem-vindos aqui na Faculdade de Educação Física da Unicamp. Um ótimo dia de trabalho para vocês. Malu, obrigado, sucesso.
Bom dia de novo, pessoal. Eu queria só ressaltar o quão importante é esse evento. Eu queria aqui que vocês aproveitassem a oportunidade, quão única é essa oportunidade da gente ter 7 pesquisadores internacionais aqui na área de educação física inclusiva, para a gente discutir. São pesquisadores que são muito abertos ao diálogo, compreendem a nossa dificuldade com a língua, então não se sintam envergonhados ou intimidados para conversar com eles. Eu queria que realmente vocês aproveitassem a oportunidade que a gente está tendo aqui hoje. É um evento muito importante para nós, né? O primeiro evento que a gente tem do nosso Centro de Equidade, Educação Física e Esporte Paralímpico, que a gente vai ser apoiado aí pela FAPESP. Então, é um movimento importante também. É um movimento também de reconhecimento da nossa tradição histórica na área de adaptada, né? Quando que a gente teve isso historicamente? A vinda de pesquisadores do hemisfério norte para escutar a gente, para falar com a gente. Então, é uma mudança aí epistemológica no nosso campo. Eu queria que vocês realmente entendessem o quão importante é esse evento. Eu não poderia encerrar aqui sem agradecer o apoio que eu recebi da reitoria, né, que tem apoiado a vinda dos pesquisadores. Acho que é legal vocês saberem também que eles vieram com financiamento próprio. Isso também é super importante, porque demonstra o reconhecimento que eles têm pelo que a gente tem feito aqui, pelas discussões que têm nascido aqui na nossa universidade. Querendo ou não, a Unicamp ela é ponta na área de atividade física na América do Sul, não só no Brasil. Então, isso faz parte do nosso reconhecimento. Estou muito feliz com o dia de hoje. São 2 dias de festa. Eu queria realmente, tudo foi pensado para que vocês aproveitem muito a interação e o diálogo com os nossos colegas. Eu agradeço imensamente que vocês vieram aqui escutar e compartilhar o conhecimento com a gente. E também quero agradecer a nossa direção, que tem apoiado, a pós-graduação, que fez o evento acontecer. A gente tem muitos funcionários envolvidos para que hoje sejam 2 dias muito legais e de muito aprendizado para nós. Então, eu só queria pedir para a gente aproveite mesmo, engajem com conversas e tudo mais. Com relação a questões práticas, as palestras serão em inglês, como foi colocado lá no evento. A gente tem alguns aplicativos no telefone que vocês podem fazer a tradução simultânea. Não é perfeito, mas é bem efetivo, tá? Para aqueles que tiverem uma dificuldade. Uma outra questão, na hora das perguntas, se você não se sente à vontade em fazer perguntas em inglês, a gente tem pessoas que vão ajudar aqui. Então, a gente tem a Tati. Tati, se você puder levantar a mão lá no fundo, ela vai ajudar. Se você quiser fazer uma pergunta, ela pode traduzir a pergunta para o inglês. Então, não deixem de fazer perguntas, tirem as dúvidas de vocês, tá bom? Então, a palestra é em inglês, a gente tem os aplicativos, tem o momento das questões, 10 horas a gente vai ter o coffee break, momento de vocês participarem e integrarem aí com os pesquisadores. Tá bom? Estou muito feliz, hoje é um dia de festa para nós. Eu vou aproveitar, vou chamar a nossa primeira palestra, o professor Justin Haegele. Acho que o Justin Haegele não precisa de apresentações. Quem é que não conhece Justin Haegele no Brasil? Né? Quem é que nunca leu um paper, um artigo do professor Justin? Mas só para fazer uma introdução formal, o professor Justin é professor na Old Dominion University, nos Estados Unidos, e veio aqui para falar com a gente de... Espera aí que eu tenho o nome da palestra dele aqui. Inclusion, Physical Education and Research with Justin Haegele. Come.
I'm going to go back here. I'm going to go back here so that I can keep track of where I'm at, hopefully. I need to figure out how to move off the QR code, though. Me neither. But that's okay. So I first visited Unicamp back in 2013 when I was a PhD student, and it's really nice to be back and be able to meet a lot more people and see some familiar faces. I met Malu back then, and I'm always impressed with what's happening at Unicamp. Typically, when I think of adapted physical activity in South America, I look right at Unicamp because to me this is the place where a lot of the best stuff in South America happens. So it's a huge privilege and honor to be able to be here and speak with you all and talk about some of the things I'm thinking about. So this presentation is mostly about stuff that I spend a lot of time thinking about, a little bit of time writing about, very little time talking to people in schools about, but it's stuff that I think about a lot, and it's stuff that represents a lot of collective work with Anthony Maher, who's here as well. And so after the presentation, if you have questions about the work, I'm happy to talk about it, but also feel free to ask Anthony questions as well. He's got a different English accent because he's from the UK, and it's a very specific part of the UK, which has a very specific accent. And so it'll be fun to try to decipher what he's saying. But with that, I'm going to talk about inclusion a bit. See if this is going to work. Great. I'm going to talk about inclusion a bit and concepts around inclusion and the idea of inclusion, conceptualizations of inclusion. I'm going to talk a little bit about exclusion as well, and then I'm going to bring up a concept that Anthony and I have been developing for a bit of time now called inclusion porn, which essentially is around the exploitation of disabled people for the purpose of gaining social capital for non-disabled people. And so this is a relatively new concept. We borrowed words and phrases and ideas from the concept of inspiration porn, which was made popular by Stella Young maybe 20 years ago, to redevelop this idea and introduce it into like the physical education literature or the education literature. But let's start here. So this is a photo of Anthony and I standing together thinking about what the word inclusion means, which happens often. We're a little more formal in this photo or drawing. But oftentimes we think about the word inclusion and we hear the word inclusion in schools and research and scholarship and practice and policy, but we don't talk about what the word inclusion means. And so this is a problem that he and I talked about extensively over the last 7 or so years since we started working together. And really this collective group of scholars here talk about together as well, even during breakfast today. And so this concept of inclusion came out of, or a lot of time is credited to the Salamanca meeting the Salamanca meeting that inclusion is generally said to have derived from. But the meaning of this concept hasn't really been well established, even though it seems like it's well established. It seems ubiquitous, like everybody talks about inclusion and we should know what that means. But a lot of times it comes with a lot of ambiguous meaning or undefined meaning. A lot of times this is just a form of education speak or edu-speak to make us feel like we're doing something positive for students. Less so are we thinking about what the students are experiencing. And so the concept that we've talked about most is this disembodied idea of a body within a space, right? And so when we think about problems with inclusion, we start with inclusion as a physical space that kids with and without disabilities are together. And we think about this as inclusion a lot of times. When I was coming up through my master's work as a teacher in schools and then through my PhD work, what I was told is inclusion is just putting kids with disabilities in the same physical space as children without disabilities. And that was essentially it. We never talked beyond this. And that was really the precipice for a lot of the issues that Anthony and I started working through when we started talking about inclusion. We think that people celebrate this. I've seen scholars in physical education celebrate that concept, just putting kids in the same space my entire career in the US. And I think it's quite problematic. And there's a load of different reasons why this concept is problematic. And we list these in a couple of different papers that we write, but I'll share a couple of them with you today. First is that when we think about inclusion as a physical space, we can then say that inclusion is successful just when kids are in the same space. And that might not seem like an incredible problem from like superficially, but this doesn't take into account how people experience those spaces, right? And so we can all be in the same space, and people can have really positive experiences within that space, but people can also have really negative experiences within that space. And when we only think of inclusion as a space, that means we're putting people into a space or a place without accounting for what happens within that space. Another issue is oftentimes teachers aren't challenged to change what they're doing when inclusion is just a space. And because of that, students are just expected to fit into what exists in a space. So there's no reason for a teacher to change their behavior within a classroom, a physical education classroom or any classroom, if inclusion is thought of as a space because they're already successful and now kids have to fit into that space. They also can just have a one-size-fits-all model to education. And so there's a lot of concepts that are introduced in physical education or education literature that essentially support a one-size-fits-all model to education. Something like universal design for learning says you can develop a class that just says, or that just does one thing that accordingly is based on the needs of all of the students in there, but there's very, very little flexibility within the construction of that class. And so a lot of ways, the students are then forced to fit into what exists rather than having education that's flexible to their needs. Understanding inclusion as a space or place also helps support a hierarchy where one space or place is considered better than other spaces or places. And so if we think of inclusion as a space and inclusion is inherently good, that means that self-contained classes or separate classes or reverse mainstream classes or any other type of class is then devalued because it's inherently less good than an inclusive space. And is that really fair? Is the best education that students with disabilities can get, is it always in an integrated or an inclusive space? Or is it possible that learning or other outcomes that are associated with physical education would be better supplied in spaces that are just kids with disabilities? And this is a difficult conversation to have because a lot of times the people I speak to in the US and in other places, when we talk about ideas about the possibility of other spaces being better than integrated or inclusive spaces, this challenges some core understandings of what they believe our field should be. When we say that maybe kids can have a better experience, better learning outcomes in self-contained classes, that directly conflicts with the ideas that inclusionists have had since the 1980s about inclusive spaces being better. And so that creates tension, and it's a hard conversation to have. And lastly, when we think of inclusion as a space, and I've already alluded to this, what we do is we ignore how people feel within that space. It doesn't matter to us as teachers if our goal is to teach inclusively, and the only thing we think about is the physical space that kids are placed in. If kids have bad experiences, it's irrelevant to teachers because the space is already inclusive. And I think this was the beginning of the biggest issues that we found with inclusion. And so this is a position a lot of people have, that inclusion is their thing, it's their love language, it's their problem, or it's not their problem, it's their passion. For me, I found a lot of problems with this, to the point that we've even written poems about the problems that we see with inclusion. And so this is a poem called 10 Things I Hate About Inclusion that was in a book chapter for a book from two Canadian scholars named Donna Goodwin and Maureen Connolly. And in this, we talk through a host of different issues that we saw with the way in which inclusion is used today within physical education literature. And perhaps the biggest issue here is not that inclusion is inherently bad, but it's more so the way that inclusion has been used by non-disabled stakeholders for them to gain social and political capital, and less to think about the experiences that disabled people have when they're within our classes. The poem was based on this movie, 10 Things I Hate About You. You guys know that movie? This is one of my wife's favorite movies, and so I've watched this movie like 300 times because my wife really likes bad romantic comedy movies. You can see me sitting there watching the movie thinking about writing a poem because I've watched too many romantic comedy movies. So what is inclusion then, right? I've just went on 3-4 slides, 10 minutes talking about maybe inclusion isn't what we think it is, maybe it's a problem. And so one of the first things that Anthony and I started talking about is rethinking the idea of what inclusion can or should mean. And this isn't really new to the literature either. The first time this was in APAC, our international journal that I'll talk about tomorrow, it was introduced by Nancy Spencer, who is a faculty member at the University of Alberta, where she actually borrowed her definition for inclusion from some work from Steinbeck in the 90s about inclusion not being a space. It's not a place. It's not a strategy. It's not a checklist. It's not something that you can do to a class. You can't teach inclusively. Instead, inclusion is a feeling or an experience that the person within the class has. And so that's something that Steinbeck said. That's something that Nancy said in her 2010 paper in APAC. And that's something that Anthony and I ended up using to start redeveloping what we think inclusion can or should be or could be within the field of adapted physical activity. And so we want to move inclusion beyond a physical space and think more so about how people experience that space. So for us, it matters less what non-disabled stakeholders say. It matters less what I say about something being inclusive or not inclusive. And it matters more so what the kids or the people are saying within those spaces or places. And so this is the fundamental statement that guides a lot of the work and a lot of my thinking with inclusion, which is we need to start placing feelings of being included above feelings like we are including people. In my opinion, our field has focused the last 40 years on teachers feeling like they are including students and less on students feeling like they are included within classes. And you can see this in the adapted physical activity literature, where we have a considerable focus on things like teachers' self-efficacy, beliefs, perspectives, or attitudes toward inclusion. And maybe in the last 10 years, a rise in research that's now looking at the perspectives of kids within classes. And you see it in Brazil now, you see it abroad, like this research is growing and continuing to grow. A lot of the people in this room have contributed to this literature, but I think this is the future of where we're going with inclusion and then past inclusion. And that's funny to me because of our conversation at breakfast today. And so the first thing that we did, and this is right before Anthony and I started working on this work, one of the important pieces was thinking about the word inclusion and how we can separate that from a space. And so I actually saw the separation of inclusion and integrated spaces for the first time when I was in Sao Carlos in 2013. I saw a presentation and somebody had a column that had inclusion and somebody had a column that had, or integration, and somebody had a column that I believe said social justice. And I looked at it and I thought, that's really interesting. It's an interesting way to look at what we do. And what I wanted to do was take that idea and use it with the word inclusion. And so instead of thinking of inclusion as the space, we brought back the word integration, which is from the 1980s, or came from what we read in the 1980s about it being a space, and inclusion being instead an experience that the people are having within that space. It's a very simple distinction, but it helps us provide language that allows us to do things like problematize the inclusiveness of integrated spaces. And so we're no longer thinking of the space as being inclusive. We have to separate the words in order to then explore the problems within those terms and those spaces. The next step here was digging deeper into what these different things mean. So with Anthony, we wrote a paper, what we'd call this, toward a conceptual understanding of inclusion as intersubjective experiences. Within this paper, we reintroduced the distinction between integrated and inclusive space, or integrated spaces and inclusion as an intersubjective experience. And we also put definitions in for the tenets of what we believe inclusion to be, which is feelings of acceptance, feelings of belonging, and a sense of value or feeling valued. And so those are the three central feelings that we look for to call a space or a place or an experience inclusive. So now we have these different definitions that we've introduced or tried to reintroduce into the literature. Because of the way in which we've conceptualized inclusion as a personal and lived embodied experience, we've now changed the way in which we can even understand whether something is inclusive. So instead of being able to say the space is inclusive based on a stakeholder believing that what they're doing within the space is inclusive, power is now in the hands of the students within the class to say whether something is inclusive. So no longer can we say, this space is inclusive, this space is not inclusive. Instead, it's the student saying, I feel included, I don't feel included, and here's why. Here's some more important reasons that this distinction is important. It recognizes that disabled and non-disabled kids may physically be in the same place, but they may experience those places quite differently. Maybe you have an integrated space. Maybe there's non-disabled kids within that space that feel great about the space. They love the activities. There may also be non-disabled kids that don't feel great about those activities. Maybe you have disabled students within those spaces that feel accepted, a sense of belonging, a sense of value. There may also be disabled kids that don't feel those feelings, right? And so what we're doing here is now saying people in the same space can feel differently, and one space that may be integrated or not integrated may provide feelings and experiences of inclusion for some kids, but not other kids. And it's not disability, like a disability binary where disabled kids will feel it, non-disabled kids won't, or vice versa, but rather that each individual kid may or may not feel these tenets of inclusion. It also disallows inspection criteria to guide whether or not something's inclusive. A checklist that's observational cannot say something is inclusive or not inclusive based on this definition of inclusion. It also lets us problematize inclusion, and this perhaps is the most important thing to me, is we can now look at a setting, or not look at the setting, we can now talk to people who are within a setting, a space, a place, a class, ask them questions about whether they feel included within that class, so we can explore whether feelings of inclusion are happening within spaces. Another important facet here is that inclusion is thought of as fluid. It has a temporal dimension. It can change over time. And so you may be in a class, you may be a teacher within a class, or meet a teacher within a class and analyze the class and find that kids feel included on Monday, having a great experience on a Monday. On a Tuesday, it could be the same place, the same teacher. That doesn't guarantee that those experiences still exist. And Monday and Tuesday is just an easy dichotomy, but it could be by the moment, by the minute, by the half an hour, by the hour. You could have felt included when I started this presentation, or when I said a joke about my wife liking romantic comedies. But now that I've talked for 5 minutes, you may think this is quite boring, you know, maybe feel a little less like you're having a good experience. So experiences change very quickly, right? And there's really no way for you as an observer, this goes back to the last point, to know. So I can see a lot of faces in here. I don't know what those faces mean. I don't know what your facial expressions mean. I would need to talk to you to find out what those facial expressions mean. So sometimes people have said to me, like, how do you talk to autistic kids, for example, who have limited expressive or receptive language skills? But just seeing a smile is not an answer, right? I think a lot of people assume a smile is an answer, but a smile can mean a lot of things, like, I'm really nervous. I'm going to smile, so maybe he won't ask me any questions, right? I know college students do that a lot. So I think figuring out ways also, and this is a bit of a tangent, to talk to people who you may not think initially can have those same types of conversations is quite important. So when we talked about inclusion, I remember having a conversation with Anthony about the need to also talk about exclusion, right? And so initially we were talking about this idea of, is exclusion just the absence of inclusion? So would exclusion, or a feeling of exclusion, be the absence of feelings of acceptance, belonging, and value? And after talking about it for some time, I think we came to the realization that a feeling or an experience shouldn't just be the absence of another experience. And so Anthony took the lead on this work, and we worked on reconceptualizing or rethinking exclusion as inter and intra subjective experiences that are rooted in psycho-emotional disablement, which came from the ableism literature. It could be direct and structural, it could be indirect, or it could be indirect and structural, it could be direct and relational, reactional. There's a lot of more complicated concepts in this paper because Anthony wrote it or led it. And you can ask Anthony about exclusion. after the presentation. But here again, there's an important element here to bring up, which is that, again, we're centering the experiences of kids. We're not saying just because you're in a different place, you're excluded. We're not saying just because you're only around disabled students, you're excluded, because that would mean that the only value that disabled kids would have is when they're around non-disabled kids. And that really doesn't make sense. That reinforces ableist hierarchies, that the only value disabled kids have is when we're putting them near non-disabled kids in integrated settings. And so for us, the setting isn't what guides whether a kid is included or excluded. If you talk to children and they're experiencing a subjective experience of exclusion, that could be in a variety of different spaces or places. We're going to move on. So that's what this figure essentially means. So what we think traditionally, I believe in adapted physical activity, is inclusion happens in integrated settings, exclusion happens in segregated settings, and every other setting is far too confusing for us to understand, so we don't really talk about it, right? So like reverse mainstream settings, where there's a few kids that are non-disabled with a whole bunch of disabled kids, we don't really understand that, so we don't talk about it, right? We know it could exist, but we can't get deeply into the concepts related to it. And so with the conceptualizations that Anthony and I have talked about and written a little bit about and think about probably far too often, each of these experiences could happen in any of these places. So feelings of inclusion, being acceptance, belonging, and value, can happen in integrated settings, can happen in self-contained or segregated or separated settings, can happen in other settings. So a disability sport class where it's just disabled students, or a disability sport, like a Paralympic sport team, people can feel accepted, a sense of belonging, and a sense of value within that team, right? The Paralympics are a really important movement internationally. I know Brazil has an excellent tradition in the Paralympics. I think it would be very limited thinking for us to say that people can't feel accepted, a sense of belonging, and a sense of value as athletes on a Paralympic team in Brazil. But that's what the initial conceptualization, or the space or place-based conceptualization of inclusion suggests, is that you cannot be accepted on that team, or included on that team, or feel included on that team. But I believe that with the idea of inclusion as a subjective experience, thinking about acceptance, belonging, and value, the space, whether it's a Paralympic team or an integrated class, is irrelevant. If those feelings exist, then people can feel or experience inclusion. This is probably the place that I experienced the most tension talking to other faculty in the US about inclusion, because there's such a predominant belief that in order for disabled kids to be included, they must be with non-disabled kids. So there is a host of scholarship that we've now worked on over the last, I want to say 7 years, with regard to inclusion as a subjective experience. I'll share a little bit of it with you all, just because I don't want to take up the whole day. But the first time that I spent time exploring the feelings or sense of inclusion within an integrated space was the paper that's on the screen. In this paper, we talked with blind and visually impaired adults in the US, and we asked them to reflect about their experiences that they had while they were students. And we started with adults for a really specific reason, which is we wanted them to be emotionally disconnected from being within the space. We didn't want them to have feelings about the current events that are happening in their life and not feel as though they could separate from that and have a conversation. And we also didn't want them to feel like we were going to go tell their teachers, like, hey, this kid doesn't feel included, or they've talked about all these negative things that are happening. We eventually got to this place, and I'll share those studies in a bit. But at the time, we thought it would be challenging for them to provide honest and explicit and thorough responses about whether they felt accepted, a sense of belonging, a sense of value within their classes. And so the findings in this paper were pretty much what we had expected, is that like kids, or they remembered being integrated in the space. So they were enrolled in spaces with non-disabled kids, but they didn't feel a sense of acceptance, a sense of belonging, a sense of value within those spaces. The interesting thing to me was, even though they didn't have those experiences, they still wanted to be in that space. And so their yearning or their desire was for us to figure out how to get kids into those spaces and make those feelings happen within those spaces, which conceptually is quite challenging. And I don't know if we have those skills today. And I think part of the reason we don't have those skills is we're not thinking about, or we hadn't been thinking about, how to construct experiences that support those feelings within those spaces. That is work that is ongoing, of course. And so I do have some quotes on here that are direct. This one, I'm going to get a little closer to the screen because I can't read it without it, but it says, a lot of times inclusion is fake. They, being the schools, will be like, oh, we need to have disabled people. Let's include them so we look good. It's fake. It's overused, and a lot of times it's fake. It's too forced. Schools do it for the look. They want to look diverse, but it has to be genuine. I don't know how it can be implemented, and it's a hard thing because everyone is different. And so this is one of the quotes that spoke to us about like why inclusion is superficial a lot of times, while it's something that's communicated by schools a lot of times, but they're not supporting teachers in creating or constructing spaces that support feelings of inclusion within those spaces. And so here's another paper that we did that looked at the levels of access that are necessary for people to feel included. And again, this is with blind and visually impaired adults for the same reasons as the last paper. And what we ended up finding is that there were 3 different levels of exclusion that were happening at the time. And this is before we worked on conceptualizing exclusion as an experience and not access to a space. But in this paper, the first step was there were a lot of kids enrolled in integrated classes that were essentially removed from those classes and placed into other spaces by themselves without participating in any activities. And so a lot of times it was kids being told to leave the integrated space and go to a library, not work on any physical activity or sport-related activities. Sometimes at least one student was told to go throw a ball in a closet in another building. So there were a lot of different times where they were reflecting back on their experiences. And again, these are adults, right? But what they remembered were these times where they were told to get out or go to another space instead of, feeling accepted, a sense of belonging, a sense of value, either from their teacher or from their peers. The second level was there were a host of people who were allowed in the space, but were taken out of the activity, right? And so they were told, you can be here, and these are blind and visually impaired adults. Go watch us sit on the bleachers. Don't participate. There was a third level of access that was you can participate in the activity, but you're going to participate as somebody who's in a meaningless role. So you can be a scorekeeper, or you can be the referee for a game that we're playing. Referees being, a lot of times in a lot of sports, a very observational participatory role, which is challenging for people who have challenges with observing things. So I'm going to skip over these quotes because I've been given the you're going a bit fat, or you're going over time already signal. So we've also talked to autistic youth about very similar things. When we talked to these youth, it was actually quite a bit difficult, more difficult because of some of the things that they had exposed to us about bullying, about their time in integrated spaces, about navigating locker rooms. We had one particular kid, and the narrative is on the screen. I'm not going to read it because of how sensitive it is, but I think these are being shared with you, where somebody was bullied to the point of self-harming afterwards because of the things that happened within their PE spaces. And again, not feelings of inclusion, rather experiences of bullying and exclusion within their classes. On the other side, we've also talked to people who have been educated within self-contained spaces. And in this particular paper, we asked students to draw what they were experiencing within PE in their self-contained places instead of asking them questions directly. So kids were drawing their experience, and I was asking them questions while they were drawing to get a sense of what they were talking about or what they were drawing. And a few of the pictures that I really enjoyed are the ones I'll pop up on the screen. In the top one, I was talking to a student. I asked them to draw themselves within PE. The first thing they did was they drew themselves. They were the blue person. They drew themselves with the basketball. If you look at their face, they're smiling. We asked them why they're smiling. They started drawing their friends. Their friends are in the class with them. They're having a good experience. This is a self-contained class that's just kids with disabilities. No non-disabled kids in here. And so again, it reinforces this idea that like as a society, we tend to think the only experiences that are good is going to be when disabled kids are entered into the same space as non-disabled kids. But we actually have found that kids tend to experience these tenets of inclusion when they're around other kids that, you know, accept them, unsurprisingly. Last paper in here that I'll share is one of the more recent ones. We spent some time after writing a lot of papers about adults that were blind or visually impaired reflecting back. We were getting some criticisms and people saying things like, well, that could be 20 years ago. How do you know that's still happening today? So we started talking to blind or visually impaired kids in the US at the time, high school kids. Pretty much the same exact stuff was happening, that kids are in the same classes or they exist within the same spaces, they're enrolled in the same classes, but they're not feeling accepted, a sense of belonging, a sense of value. They're also not getting the educational outcomes that PE promises. They're not learning about how to engage in physical activity. In fact, more of what they're learning is that their bodies are incapable of being physically active. That's the overwhelming message that a lot of kids are getting while they're in PE in the US. Most of these are in the US. So I do have some quotes up here. I'll read one of them to you because I think it's pretty impactful. It said, I mean, it's disappointing. A lot of my peers have been able to have meaningful relationships with me in other classes, but I feel like in PE there's a lot more distance between me and everyone else just because of the activities we do. And so, yeah, it's a little disappointing, frustrating at times, and isolating as well. And so to me, this is even more problematic than saying PE doesn't provide those opportunities for acceptance, belonging, and value, is when we find out that those feelings exist in other places in the school day. And so we know PE has a lot of potential. We think of PE as a really important space or place for students to get their education. But what we're finding is that those feelings of inclusion, those promises that we can make to kids are happening in other places throughout the school day, but not in the place that we care about. And so why porn, right? This is just like this needlessly controversial word to bring up in a presentation about inclusion. And so years ago now, a woman who works at University of Virginia sent me an email saying, we talk about inspiration porn, we talk about how there are posters up with disabled kids saying like, you can do it if I can do it, and things of that nature. But why don't we talk about inclusion porn? Why don't we talk about the ways in which inclusion is used by non-disabled people to essentially gain capital? And this woman, I emailed her back and I said, that's a great idea. Do you mind if I run with it? And then I did what I typically do when there's an idea that's probably a little controversial, and I messaged Anthony and I asked him if he wanted to think about this together. We spent a good amount of time, probably years, thinking about this concept before we ever published anything about it. But we did end up writing a paper about it, and this is the first time I've explained it in a talk. I brought it up years ago in Chile at a conference and got some interesting reactions from it. But so for us, this was an opportunity for us to introduce a phrase or a term to PE and to education to be used to think about our behaviors as researchers or scholars or teachers, practitioners, right? So this isn't accusatory. This is an idea that we can think with to guide our behavior or to guide our thinking. And so here we talked about the issues with these ambiguous and conflicting word or concepts of inclusion, and how these ambiguous concepts have now allowed us or opened the door for non-disabled people to use the word inclusion to gain social capital, to essentially use it to marginalize disabled people or to exploit disabled people. And so that paragraph basically says exactly what I said right before I started showing the first paragraph. Conceptual tool. And so there's these 4 features that we worked on to talk about what inclusion porn is. And again, it's about non-disabled people using the word inclusion to marginalize non-disabled people, not to provide inclusive experiences, but rather to gain social capital. And so for us, the 4 features are that inclusion appears to be more concerned with stakeholders or who promote or attempt inclusion than disabled people's feelings and experiences within inclusion. And so if there are non-disabled stakeholders peddling ideas about what you should be doing within your classes, and it's obvious that there's political or social or monetary gain, and they haven't worked with disabled people to develop those strategies, or they're not talking about whether disabled people within those spaces will feel included within those spaces or gain educationally within those spaces, I would refer to that as inclusion porn. A second piece is that inclusion porn is fabricating a reality that's always attainable, always pleasurable, satisfying, and no one ever gets emotionally hurt. So when we talk about inclusion in the literature, a lot of times, once we say the word inclusion, it's perfect, right? Inclusion is amazing. Inclusion is fantastic. In the literature from the 80s into the 2010s in adapted physical activity, inclusion is only thought of as a positive thing. Now, I'm not going to tell you inclusion is not a positive thing, because I spent a bunch of time talking about how inclusion can be thought of as an experience of acceptance, belonging, and value, which I would argue is a positive thing. But the way in which it's been used as a space, people assume that it's always positive once you say a space is inclusive. Once I assign the phrase or the term inclusion to something, people just assume it's a good thing. Next is that disabled people aren't viewed as individuals and are objectified to meet the goals of non-disabled people. We see this with admin a lot within public schools, where disabled people are not people. Disabled people are objects or numbers that are placed within settings to meet the needs of the admin. And finally, it's a largely performative experience. It matters less what's happening or how it's happening, but more so that it's happening. So the important thing is that something is labeled as inclusive, not what's happening once we label it inclusive. And so that's a brief explanation of a very complex concept that we tried to explain. We've also written this book that I have up on the screen, which essentially explores inclusive, quote unquote, inclusive strategies that have been published over the last 20 years in a variety of different ways. And I'd argue that a lot of these strategies they fit the tenets of what we would conceptualize as inclusion porn. So a lot of people publishing practitioner-based papers, which then gives them social or political capital within academia, without very much evidence that either they provide any educational outcomes for disabled people or that disabled people have worked with them to develop those strategies. So some concluding thoughts for you. We're not suggesting this is the only way to think about inclusion. Rather, these are ways that we've talked about and written about inclusion over the last 7 or so years. I would suggest that this is a reintroduction of a concept about inclusion where we've probably just spent a lot more time thinking about and writing about it. I don't think this necessarily means that people should discard their own beliefs about inclusion, but rather to think about a different way to consider inclusion. I think that there's often these ableist ideas about how we educate people within PE, but we're not always acknowledging that the behaviors that we ourselves represent oftentimes are ableist, and we come from an ableist society, so it's really difficult for us to say that something is not ableist when everything we're doing is rooted in that ableism. And so to me, this is about encouraging people to think differently, to think beyond what we know as reductive and material understandings of how we work with disabled people and move toward new ways to think about what disabled people are saying, why they're saying it, how they're experiencing various things within educational settings, spaces, places. So it's really difficult to say what's next. We've been talking about, and even at breakfast had a great conversation about, like, where do we go from here? And I don't think we have an answer for where to go next. I think inclusion's overused. Personally, I think people have understandings that are pretty developed when it comes to inclusion, and I think it's really easy to even take these conceptualizations of inclusion and use them in ways that are unintentionally harmful. And we've seen this at conferences where people are saying they think these are great ideas for inclusion, but they revert back to their older material understandings of inclusion and present concepts that can be more problematic than helpful for disabled people. And I'm also not speaking from the perspective of a disabled person, and I realize that a lot of what I'm saying even perpetuates these same ableist norms, which I think is challenging. I would personally think the best place for us to go is to turn our spotlight on us, to think about what we do, why are we doing it, how are we doing it? Are we doing it in ways that are just continuing to perpetuate the idea of using inclusion to gain our own social capital? Are we recolonizing the idea of inclusion so that now we're the ones that get the capital instead of the people who use these material understandings that we're challenging? It's a really difficult place to be as a person who thinks about this quite often. But I do think it's a really important conversation to have. And I think we need to have this with disabled people, disabled students, disabled advocates, disability advocates, people within the disability studies community. Those are the voices that are really important here. Probably not my voice, more so those voices, so we can see what they want and need and what their desires are, and then we support those. So, said a lot of things. I hope that was helpful. I hope it wasn't too boring. I am really thankful to be here, though. Again, thank you to Malu and for Unicamp for hosting all of us and allowing us an opportunity to speak with all of you and to meet you. And like I said, it's been some time since I've been here, so it's quite nice to be back. And hopefully it doesn't take 13 years to come back again, but it might. But thank you, and that's all I've got. You want me to sit down? Oh, I still need this. Was that too much time? Are you going to come join me? This is Anthony. Here, you sit behind the computer. That was a lot of talk.
So we have time for a few questions, okay?
Testing, testing.
Bom, pessoal, então agora a gente tem a oportunidade de algumas perguntas. Eu espero que a gente tenha perguntas, por favor. Tá? Então, quem quer ser... Se você quiser fazer uma pergunta em português, está tudo bem também. A gente tem a Tati aqui com a gente. E, então, é isso. Quem quer ser o primeiro? Dúvidas? André?
Faço em português para todo mundo entender. Pode ser assim, Tati? Vocês, expert. Bom dia. Estou fazendo então, essa pergunta em português. Pelo que eu entendi da apresentação, a inclusão passa a ser um conceito intrasubjetivo.
She's going to translate for you, I think.
This is an Anthony question. I can tell without it translating Anthony's.
You should understand in Portuguese.
He wants to know what does it mean to be intersubjective.
You're quite good in Portuguese.
Is that close?
Então, a minha questão é o seguinte, como passa a ser um conceito intrasubjetivo, né, o que isso impacta em termos de método na pesquisa de inclusão e o que isso impacta em termos de translação desse conhecimento para a prática.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a really good question, because one of the things, I think firstly, it's important to distinguish between subjectivity and intersubjectivity. So a lot of the work in this field positions and frames subjectivity, the internalized reality, experience, how it's experienced emotionally, and how the body experiences physical education and movement. And I think one of the distinctions that we wanted to make was the relational aspect to that. So it probably seems quite obvious, but we try to move away from subjectivity to intersubjectivity for that particular reason. Now, when it comes to what comes next, I think what we haven't done, and this doesn't answer the question, but it partly addresses it, is we need to really explore this empirically, because we're operating at a very theoretical level at the moment. So empirically, we need to explore different methods and methodologies to how we can capture this and these experiences and these feelings intersubjectively. Because what we probably haven't done, or the only thing that we have done, is use traditional methods to do this. You know, like interviews, like conversations, drawings, some more creative and participatory approaches, but that's a direction that we're walking along that we haven't really taken yet? So I know that doesn't answer the question, but I think that's a very important question because that's something that we're thinking about, how to explore this empirically and what creative methods and methodologies enable us to do that. Do you have anything to add?
Okay, thank you.
Because there are limits to those traditional approaches that we are using.
Quem mais?
I did understand the question. I interpreted it the same way.
Bom dia,
Bom dia.
meu nome é Kevin, sou aluno do professor Edson, estou cursando o doutorado, primeiro fiz o mestrado na UNB e gostaria de parabenizar pela fala, foi excelente.
Thank you.
A minha pergunta é, pensando do ponto de vista prático, estando num ambiente inclusivo ou adaptado, como eu posso desenhar jogos ou atividades para trabalhar com turmas e tornar esse ambiente com sensações de inclusão?
Do you want me to?
So I think that's a really difficult question. And I don't think there's an answer for that question. And I think the reason there isn't an answer for that question is because every child is needs to experience potentially something different in order for them to feel accepted, a sense of belonging, a sense of value. And so if I said, here are 5 things that you can do, those may work for one child, but they likely won't work for all the children. And I think that's the issue that we're trying to combat is the bag of tricks approach to teaching of like, here's 10 inclusive strategies that you can use, and then you don't ever move beyond that. For me, the most important piece of teaching is speaking with the kids and being actively engaged in conversation about how they feel while they're within your classes, and changing and being reflective in your teaching about those opinions that are shared with you. And so if there's one behavior that I would suggest, it would be active communication with kids, asking them very regularly about pieces of the class that were helpful or not helpful, and then taking that in consideration as you continue to develop and shape what you're doing as an instructor.
And just very quickly to add on that, I think one of the areas of development for us is thinking about how to use critical reflexive practices, pedagogical practices to enable that to happen. That's a kind of idea that we're grappling with. What kind of frameworks or ideas can teachers use to reflexively consider how inclusive the practice is, and dialogue, communication, and the active agency of children and young people is absolutely crucial to that type of approach.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Quem mais?
I think you all ask in English. I would like you to, if it's possible, to speak a little bit about the experience of inclusion in your countries, USA and UK, from the public policies perspective, and then from this subjective perspective, please.
I think what's interesting, because you mentioned public policy, there's different ways that we're trying to think about it, because often we think about it pedagogically. And if we want to enact any meaningful change, I think the policy domain is really important in the UK for trying to enact that type of change, because we have the standards that we use to train our teachers, as example, and inclusion is a part of teacher training standards, as I'm sure it is in many countries. but those standards and those ideas about inclusion are still very much rooted in pedagogical practice, like differentiation, modification, adaptation, scaffolding. It's something that's done by teachers rather than necessarily something that's received and experienced by learners. And I think we need to, I'm not saying we need to move beyond that or change that, but I think we need to build upon it so it's more holistic and the experiences and the agency of children become an integral part of that. And in the UK, at least, I don't feel that we've done that. There's conversations about it, but there hasn't been notable and authentic change in that direction. And I think those policy drivers are really important, because in the UK, I think the government discourse and policy significantly influences behaviours in schools. So I think for that to change in a meaningful way, for the practice to change in schools in the UK, we need to start to influence policy. And for lots of different reasons, probably for the last 10 years or so, it's been very difficult to change and influence education policy in the UK. With a new government, the door is a little bit more open than it was in the past. But I'm thinking this probably from an educational perspective, and there are other policy routes to take, like sport and physical activity. So to summarize, I think there's a clear connection between policy discourse and practice in schools when it comes to inclusion. But I think if we want to initiate meaningful change, it has to be at the policy level. It probably has to be at multiple levels, but that's an area that we've probably neglected from a PE perspective.
Yeah, so in the US, it's interesting to think about inclusion in policy educationally. So people assume that IDEA, which is our main educational policy or mandate, includes inclusion as a concept, but it does not. It's never talked about in IDEA, and it's not mentioned. Instead, they talk about physical spaces and places in which students can or should be educated, and they use the least restrictive environment concept. But the word inclusion is never said or stated, and it's not discussed, which is an interesting disconnect. So admin and principals within schools and states have interpreted least restrictive environment to mean that kids should be in the same place, or disabled kids should be in the same place or space as non-disabled kids. But our policy doesn't actually say that. At the state level, there's a variety of policies. We have 50 states plus a few territories, so it's difficult to know each and every one. But in a PE perspective, within our state, in the state of Virginia, our state learning objectives include acceptance, belonging, and value as central tenets for what our objectives are, after we helped to revise them a couple of years ago. And so we've made some progress with getting this concept into our state learning objectives, which we thought was a big deal. But when it comes to federal legislation, federal educational mandates and policy, inclusion is not even discussed. So for me, there's a lot of misunderstanding of even least restrictive environment and what that means for spaces and places, that people then assume it means inclusion, and whatever inclusion means, which it depends on the person you're talking to and probably the mood they're in that day. Should I put in the water? She said two more. She said one. Eu tenho obrigação para fazer com a mulher. I can't see that far. That's why I can't drive without glasses. Okay.
Don't need it. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here and listen Justin, Anthony, and the other guys. It's a great opportunity for everyone. I have a question for Justin. I hope can be in English. We know
the physical education classes in the school, it's a great opportunity for we have kids and young kids healthily and physical activity. When I read something about the inclusion porn concept, we just think, and I just ask for you, Justin, is if possible, we understand physical education classes in the school can be considered a principal key for we have for you can agree with the inclusion porn concept. It's possible we consider physical education classes in school for how a principal key for the real concept, the concept of the inclusion porn. We can agree with this concept of your inclusion porn.
So I think that there's ways in which kids end up in integrated spaces that are positive ways, right? If a child and their family wants them to be in those spaces with non-disabled kids, if those spaces are set up really well so that the disabled kids are having positive and meaningful experiences, I think there's a lot of good things that can happen. I think it could happen within PE. I think there's a possibility of it happening. When we think about inclusion porn, we think of the motivations of the people who are peddling or perpetuating ideas of inclusion in order for their own gain. And so for me, if there's reasons why admin or researchers or scholars or teachers are thinking about their own personal benefits instead of thinking of the benefits of children that are within those spaces, to me, that's when the porn concept comes into play. It's about that marginalization. It's about non-disabled stakeholders putting their needs and wants and desires ahead of the children within the classes. You want to add to this? I could see his facial expression. He wants to add to this.
No, sorry. I did want to say something very quickly, and it was because you asked the question, because I was thinking about your research area. So for me, one of the areas of development conceptually when it comes to inclusion is to think beyond the experiences of disabled children. So we're thinking about inclusion as intersubjective experiences of belonging, acceptance, value. You could add dignity, respect, whatever that may be. Then that applies to lots of other so-called socially and culturally and politically oppressed groups. So I'm thinking about refugee and migrant communities that we work with. I'm thinking about the LGBTQ plus community. In other words, I think the parameters of our framing of inclusion could increase and could have wider significance. And that, for me, is a step that we need to take at some point in the not too distant future. Because, the whole idea of belonging, for example, is it's gaining a lot of political currency in many countries at the moment. And I think we could capitalize on that. So nothing to do with porn, completely different. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
Pessoal, agora a gente tem um tempo para um café, tá? Lá fora, tem um intervalo aí de uns 15 a 20 minutos, e depois a gente volta com a palestra do professor Martin Giese, tá bom? Não vão embora. Pessoal, vamos lá? Então, agora a gente vai ter a palestra do professor Martin Giese, da Philipps-Universität Marburg, com a temática Physical Education and Ableism. Thank you, Martin. Oh, and Martin está usando uma Havaianas em nossa homenagem. A gente vai comprar outra. Thank you, Martin.
Malu, thank you very much. I asked Malu what I should buy here in Brazil for souvenir, and she said, buy this. So, okay. Yes, thank you very much, Malu, for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here, to be part of this workshop, and to be invited to your university. Thank you so much in advance. My presentation is about physical education and ableism. We already heard something about ableism and ableist structures in the first presentation. And I brought you a picture from my town where I live. It's the castle of the University of Marburg. But it's not where I teach. It's a representative house if important guests come to my university. So I want to show you very short where I come from to get an impression. So in the middle, this is Europe, as you know it. And on the right, so Germany, you will find here in the middle. So, and where I live here in the federal state there, and this is where I come from. And it was a long trip to your wonderful country. Okay, yes, technical issues. It's okay now?
Let's start with Justin now.
Yeah, Justin, you have to start again. I try my best. No, you're welcome. Okay, so it was all part of the introduction. Okay, I have a small agenda. You will see it during my presentation. I decided to take some text on the slides because yesterday we discussed that English is not a so common language for presentations here, and so I want to speak very slowly. I'm also not a native speaker. My English is also limited. Maybe this is helpful for you because I do not know so many words in English. So, there's a lot of the things I want to say is on the slides. Okay. So a short abstract about the presentation. My presentation explores how ableism shapes PE and creates persistent barriers of students with disabilities. So it's about ableism, and it highlights the need to challenge normative assumptions of ability and promote inclusive learning environments. Okay, so far this is the abstract for the whole presentation. In the introduction is that PE is expected to contribute to inclusion. So far, this is the thesis, and what we are doing here is driven by the CRPD's call for equal education opportunities. What we see in the empirical studies is that PE is still often built around normal bodies. So what is the meaning of normal bodies? The idea is that there is an underlying idea, some structures, often unspoken, maybe hidden, who shape what is understood as a normal PE, and that these hidden structures contribute to the exclusion of disabled people. So one short position statement from my side. I talk about disabled students' disabilities as a non-disabled white researcher, male from a high-income country. So this is my perspective. I can't change this, but I want to start with a short position statement to keep in mind from which perspective I have my look on this topic. So the global context, inclusion in CRPD, I think this is well known. Also Germany signed the CRPD, and it's about Article 24, who votes for equal access to education and individualized support for participation. And this means that PE, even if it's not named explicitly in the CRPD, is included in this whole process. So what we have in Article 24 is also guilty for PE. Okay, the theoretical framework about ableism. As I already stated, Justin and Anthony, they already have spoken about ableism, and I want to step back a bit and to explain something about the approach we in the working group use for an ableism critical approach. So, and the main idea in my eyes is that ableism creates a hierarchy of abilities. So, and this hierarchy is defining what is normal and devaluing those who fall outside these norms. So, for example, schools reproduce these expectations, often labeling and separating students with disabilities. So what does it mean with normal? For example, it is considered normal to walk with 2 legs, to see that I can read, that you can read, all what I have on all my slides, and now we have people who are not able to walk, as most of us in this room may walk. And the point with the ableism critical approach is that this is not only a description, so it does not end by the point to say you can walk like this and you can walk like this. The point is that with this description, with this labeling, there is a de-evaluating. There is something what is socially constructed, what is the cause that you are not part of the PE example. Huh? So you are marginalized, you're discriminated maybe, and this is part of this idea to be not normal. So, and this frameworks, this ableism critical frameworks, give us a tool to analyze and to have a methodological approach to analyze and describe these processes. Okay, and so it's about analyzing ability-based orders of differences, and this is also analogous to sexism, racism, or classism, and we will hear something about this in other presentations. And what you can say also is that this is related to the social model of disability. So the idea behind this is that disability is not something what is an individual ability of me. Disability is constructed by the social context, and it's not my personal disability. A last example for this. So disability, for example, is not a reduced motor ability, for example, but it stands rather for the disadvantage people face as a result of the social attribution of disability. So to make it more concrete, you have a reduced intellectual capability, for example. So in Germany, we use the term intellectual disability, for example, but this is the same what I mentioned earlier. It's not only to describe that there is disability, intellectual disability. The point is that with this you have restricted areas. For example, you can't go to a mainstream school. No. Then this is the important thing, that this is linked with a powerful influence on your life, and in general, it's this influence is not so helpful for your life. So you get, for example, you can't go to a mainstream school. So, and this is also the same for ableism in PE. And in PE, in particular in PE, is that PE emphasizes physical performance, competition, and normative motor standards. So maybe we could argue that in PE, the point of an ableism critical approach is more important than in other contents, because sports in general is very linked to high performance, and that ability expectations are more present in PE than in other contents. So, and this is what I said before, students with disabilities often experience exclusion or limited participation. Okay, research on ableism in PE, we will hear more about this in the presentation from Sebastian, so it's only 4 points. There is a lot of research from the perspective of an ableism critical approach, and I would say there are 4 areas of research, and there are a lot of research about barriers experienced by students with disabilities. A lot of this research is related to visually impaired people and students. There are ableist curriculum structures, also the analyzing of ableist curriculum structures, and PE teachers' attitudes and expectations. And the last point, it's how space and materials reinforms ability norms. So this is similar to what we heard in the first presentation. And I will stop with this because Sebastian will say a lot about this approaches from a European perspective. Okay. At the same time, there are, I would always argue that there are also research gaps. The first presentation ends with the question where to go now. And research gaps from my perspective are, for example, that further analysis is needed on implicit ability expectations in lesson design. This is the point that a lot of these principles are not, they are often unspoken, they are hidden, they are implicit ability expectations. And that's another point is everyday teaching practices shaping inclusion, and how can we get an idea to promote teaching practices that promote a more inclusive environment. For that, I would also say we have to know more about the perspectives of non-disabled peers and teachers. There are a lot of studies about this point, but not from the perspective of an ableism critical approach, or not so much. And the last, special dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. We heard about settings and being settled in an integrated school setting. What I have in mind with this point is more that we also have to take a look at the buildings, for example, of the playgrounds, the way of which a playground, for example, or a sports hall is built typically, or you could also say normally. This favors some abilities and others not. So I had the opportunity to take a look in your sports hall here, very great and big hall, but it's very similar to the hall I can see in my own university. But the way how this hall is constructed, this is not neutral. This is not neutral. So there are expectations woven in the building, and how these special dynamics influence the participation and the inclusion of disabled students. This is another point I would say we have to take care of, and there's, in my eyes, there's a research gap. Okay. So historical barriers in PE. I mentioned it before, that in PE there is a focus on performance, competition, and perfection of movement. And the idea in the ableism critical approach is that if you attend PE lessons, they are based on these ideas, then it becomes more difficult to include disabled people. Disabled people. This is not that it's not possible, but it becomes more difficult. So, and we must be aware, and this is what we can learn from an ableism critical approach, that we might have some key features like performance, competition, and the perfection of movement, who are critical to change, to adapt, to make spaces for disabled people more inclusive. And so I would say that it's we all know the adapted idea, so we adapt the color of balls or the rules, or we all know these ideas. But I would always argue that yes, it's okay, it's no problem in adapting a ball color. But what we should adapt is also our maybe hidden ideas of what do we mean by competition. So we have to reflect this. And I would argue that this is maybe more important than to make adaptations on a superficial level with rules or materials. All in PE is built around normal athletic bodies. We all have an idea of normal athletic bodies. And historically, this is linked with a low participation for disabled students. Okay. I want to give you an idea of mapping different types of ableism, and these are the four types, and there's also a lot of research about these types, and I want to start with the first one, ability hierarchies in schools. And behind this is the idea that ability hierarchies are strongly linked to social hierarchies in PE classes. If you belong to a marginalized group, maybe, and your abilities does not meet the unspoken ability expectations, then you fall in danger to get a lower rank on the social hierarchy. So it's not only that you do not move accordingly, it's always linked to a social devaluating. This is the point. And students are ranked on ability. And there are some, bless you, Sebastian. There are some studies that show that this may be in particular important in PE, because the PE has a strong tradition of link to the body, of the body performance and of movement. So, and the schools, at least from my perspective, in a German, from a point of view from Germany, creates determine these social status. So this is another tool in the toolbox of de-evaluating disabled people. And so we have to think about the assessment and how it's grades. If these grades are part of the system to reproduce ability regimes. Good. Last point. There's a pressure to prove able identities. The pressure is on the disabled kids, and there is a pressure to agree, to be fixed. So there is maybe unspoken pressure on disabled people to behave like the non-disabled people, to move like the non-disabled people, and to get aid from the disabled support service, maybe. But all these aids are towards the idea to be fixed, to move accordingly as a non-disabled people. And I would say this is an important point, because although this is a reproduction of an ableist regime, I would argue. Yes, of course. Yes. So on the one side, there are the ability hierarchies. So someone is not able to walk because there is a disability, and he's not able to walk like the other kids in the class. So in this, we could say it's maybe only an ability hierarchy, but it ends not there. it is always linked. This is the idea that these people might have a lower rank in the social hierarchy, and there is no escape from this. This is the thesis, and there might other aspects who might help this kid. Maybe it has a lot of friends, or it's wearing expensive clothes, for example. There are other things who might help to get a higher rank on the social hierarchy. But there are a few studies we made in this field, and these studies show us that in the end there is no escape from getting a lower rank in the social hierarchy. Yeah. Okay, the second point is curriculum ableism. This is a tricky point, of course, because curriculum construction varies greatly from country to country, from continent to continent. Also, this is said from my perspective. It might be different here. But the curriculum development in my country, for example, it assumes an unrestricted mobility. So it is unspoken. But if you read the curriculum, the curricula for PE in Germany, then you see that there's no idea of people there's no idea involved in this curricula of people who have a disability, for example. It's not mentioned, or almost not mentioned. And these norms ignore diverse motor abilities. And so far, we could say that the curriculum development and the curricula, for at least in Germany, are part of the problem, because although these curricula reproduce ableist ideas. The next point, assessment challenges. So assessments typically are performed with normative motor tests, and they penalize physical difference. And the test items, but the test items might not be meaningful for disabled students. And I hope this will work with a slide. I want to show you something from a paper I made with Anthony and Justin together about normative motor assessment. And I want to show you a short video from the test of cross motor development. It's a TGMD, maybe it's known also here. I don't know. It's a worldwide well-known test. And this test is also used for testing disabled kids. So there are some adaptations, of course, but this test is used. And you will find paper, they say this is a gold standard, even for disabled kids. And I have something about the overhand throw. So I hope this works. Yes, you can see it. So overhand throw. This is a German version. So this is demonstration and of the test item overhand throw, and this is the manual for the testers. So and we see a woman who performs an overhand throw, and then there are some sub items, and the sub items are important to classify if it was a good movement or not. So here sorry. Oh, what happened? So and then you have the same movement in slow motion, and then there are these sub items are described. For example, the arm, the throwing arm must be on the opposite side, and then the one of the legs, and so on. There are 4 sub items. It's not so important what exactly are these sub items. I want to come back to this point here. Test items might not be meaningful for disabled students. Of course, can blind kids perform this task? There is no reason why they should not be able to throw like we have seen it in the video. But the question is if this is a meaningful task for blind kids. if we take into account the development of blind kids, they often do not have a lot of drawing experiences. Blind, very small, young blind kids, if they have, for example, a doll and they throw it in the room, they are in danger not to get it back. So the kids without visual impairment, they make a lot of throwing experiences in the first days, months, years. They throw and they, I don't know the word, they go to them and catch it again and throw it, or the parents and throw it, and they have thousands of throws when they are growing. Blind kids often do not have these experiences. If they throw things away, they learn, ooh, it's gone. Well, the doll is gone. And so there is a difference. They do not possess these experiences. So, and this is what I want to say with this point, and this is also, at least to me, a good example for the ableism critical approach. Of course, they can perform this task, but the question is if it's a meaningful task. And what should be the result of this task? The result will always be blind kids are not advanced, skilled throwers. So, but for what we should know this, what's the point? So what's the crucial point with this? The crucial point is, I would argue, is on the other layer. The crucial point is, this is another tool from the toolbox from an ableism toolbox to make it clear that these kids do not possess the necessary abilities which we think that they are important for being a competitive member of the sports area. So it de-evaluates these kids, and it's part of their not being involved in PE. So, okay, so this would be the idea. Even if they can perform it, there can also be examples where we might see that they can't perform the tasks. For example, if this throwing is directed to a goal, so if you can't see the goal, and it becomes difficult. Of course, you can make noises or something like this, but in this example, it's not important where to throw or to hit a goal. And this is one of the arguments the TGMD folk always says. The TGMD is a gold standard because it doesn't matter where to throw. You don't need to hit a goal. Just throw. And of course, you can throw, but it might be not a meaningful task. Another point, it focuses on deficits and not on progress. What we need then is that we need alternative evaluation or assessment models. Okay, last point that we have already been. So teacher beliefs and expectations. We heard about this in the first presentation. Attitudes shape inclusion outcomes, and ableist assumptions are often unexamined. So we require reflecting training in teacher education. Okay, we come to the next point, some empirical considerations. If we keep in mind what I have said about an ableist critical approach, how does it help for an empirical approach? And the first point, what is very important for me, is student voices, rare but crucial. Justin mentioned that maybe the last 5-10 years there are more and more literature who takes these voices into account. I would completely agree, but it stays a niche discourse if you see what is published in our field. So few studies center disabled perspectives, and genau. Exactly. So, and there is a lack of autonomy and support. What I have to add to this is that also, in my eyes, empirical considerations should be linked to an intersubject approach to understanding of inclusion. So I want to emphasize what we heard in the first presentation. So I have some cases, case examples, what might be a field for empirical research. So when you write your PhD thesis or want to make them as a master thesis, these are examples where I think this could be useful to use an ableist critical approach. For example, PE environments rely on vision. I think this is obvious, and we have seen it in the video. And an approach could be to analyze in how far these environments rely on vision. For example, with interview studies with visually impaired kids. And there are some studies from this perspective, but we, as far as I know, we do not have these studies like this from different regions over the globe. So this could be, I learned yesterday that you might have something in mind a bit like this. This could be an approach to use an ableist critical approach for an empirical study. Adaptations are missing or minimal, and participation depends on teachers' awareness. Although this is something we can analyze with empirical qualitative research, if this is indeed like this or not. Another example might be useful to research is wheelchair users. Obviously, it's a safe evidence that spaces often are not designed for movement diversity, for example, for wheelchair users. But although this is a general assumption, what I mentioned here. What do we know in detail from the persons with disabilities, from the wheelchair users? And there could an ableism critical approach very helpful, I would say. This does not mean that this is the only meaningful approach. This is never what I want to say, but this could be one. And he has proven that this is a fruitful approach in many research studies so far. Another point could be the social gaze and the stigma, and how far the stigma affect participation. Yes, another one. So I want to give you some ideas maybe for your empirical research. Another case example, the last one, is chronic illness in PE, and it's a similar approach. The unspoken idea behind the PE and the curriculum is that it's pain-free. It's for pain-free, fit bodies. So it's also here it's self-evident that there are a lot of people who are not pain-free and who do not belong to the group of our fit bodies. So, but it's the same. This is a very general assumption, and would be worth to investigate these approaches and these perspectives of these people. So of course, these are not only examples. Now you can use this also for other examples. Okay, and the last point. This is not really a case example, but it's one point I think it's very important, and where I think there is often a misunderstanding. We also about this we heard something in the first presentation. It would be very naive to say disability sport is not an ableism is an ableism free area. This would be very naive. And what we see in studies is that in parasport and disability sport there is something, I call it a sub-segregation. So, for example, we have kids with low vision who bully kids who are blind. So this happens in a segregated space, or in parasport or disability sports, and something like this can we see in Special Olympics and Paralympics and Deaf Olympics. We see this everywhere. This does not mean that Special Olympics is not important. No, not at all. Paralympics, we had yesterday the discussion, is a very important area of parasport, and I would never question this. But the point is, only because it's parasport, it's not free of ableist structures. So this is the point. And so this is a field there's really not so many research, and I would always also say that this research is maybe a bit difficult because it's often not supported by Special Olympics, for example, or by Paralympics movement. But nevertheless, it's important to go into these environments and be critical with these environments, not to stop them or to de-evaluate them. Sondern the position must be to help them to further develop. And there is a self-claim to be very inclusive. For example, Special Olympics has a self-claim to be the world greatest inclusive movement in the world, and so we should ask where are the borders of this self-claim and what we can do to help them to be more inclusive. So it's not against Special Olympics. Okay, I hope I didn't ruin my career now with saying this. So what should change? We come to the end. What should change in PE? And from my view, we have to move beyond the medical deficit view. It's the idea that disability is something what belongs to the individual. This is difficult. No? Maybe we have to balance out the personal influence of a person with disabilities and what is shaped by the social settings. But I think it's obvious that we have to move beyond a purely medical deficit view. We have to center diversity as normal. As long as we center unspoken ableist ideas to be normal, we won't go ahead. So we have to center diversity as normal. And I think, at least to me, there's no other way than to get involved in processes of co-design activities with students with disabilities. Okay, toward ableism sensitive PE, if we take a look at PE in particular, awareness is a start. Reading about the individual experiences of disabled students in PE, there is a lot of qualitative research, and there is a systematic change is required. What should lead us to a flexible, individualized pedagogy? And yes, I want to come to some key takeaways, what I think is important. There is four key takeaways. What we heard earlier this morning, inclusion is more than physical presence only. And the normative ability assumptions produce exclusion, and there is what we have to be aware for. PE can be a site of empowerment, even if PE maybe is a special case because ableist regimes in PE are stronger than maybe in the German class or in physics, I don't know. But still, PE can be a site of empowerment, and we need teacher awareness and curriculum reform are essential. Yes, and I will end with some discussion questions, and these are how we define success in PE. If we do not define it by like the TGMD, what you have seen in the video, if we do it not like this, then we should do it then. This is we have the critique, but the answer is still missing. How benefits from current norms, or who benefits from current norms, and what would an inclusive PE class feel like? So, and feel like is also related to the intersubjective idea of understanding of inclusion. So with these questions, I will end here some references, and yes, it's not important. Maybe we stay here with the discussion questions, and I thank you very much for your listening. Thank you. Yes, I can do it.
Bom, pessoal, então a gente tem um tempo aí para perguntas. Mariana, quer ser a primeira?
Pode fazer os dois também.
Maybe it would have been easier to perform in German and then to translate. Now I translate in a foreign language and another foreign language, but we will manage it.
Okay, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
I'm Mariana. I'm a law student. And my question is about how do we deal with ableism in school when mostly they come from the school directors or other teachers and not always come from other students? I think it's something like that.
Okay, so I have to ask back. When you say the ableism comes from school teachers?
Yeah, school teachers and principals, the administrations mostly.
Yeah, okay. Yes. This is what I meant by the curriculum term. I know that this curriculum term is very differently used in different areas. In my region where I live, this is shaped by the curriculum. The school principal cannot ask something from the PE teacher what is not written down in the curriculum. So the school principal also has to follow, yes, the school principal has to follow the curriculum. So my answer would be, from a European perspective, we have first to change the curriculum. And this is one point. And the other point, at least where I live, we have a strong tradition of sport clubs. So school is often not the whole day. And in the afternoon, the kids attending a sport club activity. And these sport club activities, they are very often very traditional sport understanding. So they play football. They throw, I don't know the word. Yes, they're throwing it, and they throw as far as they can. They run as fast as they can. They swim as fast as they can. So, and this is a classical understanding of sports and movement, and this is what we see in a lot of empirical. We have a lot of empirical evidence for this. If this is the underlying understatement of sports, then it becomes very difficult to participate for disabled kids. So from the PE side, there is a curriculum, but I would say stronger or more powerful is this unquestioned idea of what is sport. And if you think sport is only what you see in the television, and then it becomes difficult. It's not impossible, but it becomes more difficult. It's okay?
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Rafael. Thank you for your presentation. I want to hear from you a little bit more about ableism in disability sports, because I know in Paralympic Games, because it's a high-level competition, we will have exclusion and selection to be part of the games. But I want to hear from you about the ableism in Special Olympics. So what are your thoughts, and what happened that represents ableism in this movement?
Yes. In general, I want to be very careful with this topic, because I do not want to be misunderstood. I'm not against Special Olympics. So first of all, to make this point clear, I'm not against Paralympics. Please do not misunderstand me. But nevertheless, I think we have to asked also Special Olympics and Paralympics about the borders. So, and what ableist assumptions are interwoven in Special Olympics. And for example, I would say most of the empirical studies we have about, for example, Special Olympics, is that there are interview studies with guides or with disabled kids and about their experiences in Special Olympics. And most of these studies show us that this is a huge contribution to the life of these kids, a positive contribution. So everything is fine. But what we do not have is, we do not have interview studies with kids who decided not to be part of Special Olympics, even if they could. And we do not have the perspectives of kids who are not able to participate in Special Olympics. This is, from the whole picture, the studies we have is a little best practice area. And I would say what we need also is we need bad practice approaches. Of course, there are people who cannot attend to Special Olympics. What's with these kids? So my point is the state of research about, and this is the same for Paralympics, the state of research about Paralympics and Special Olympics is maybe too positive, because we are missing the voices of the kids who do not want or cannot attend these competitions. It's okay, so, but I have nothing against Paralympics.
You are safe.
Yeah, no, I had bad experiences with these topics. Yeah, I did.
Hello,
Hello.
I'm Bruna. Tati. I'm doing a question em português. Eu fiquei pensando aqui, e aí, eu estou misturando, para o Martin e para o Justin também, da palestra anterior. Or Anthony, yes, maybe. Pensando no conceito de inclusão, como validando experiências subjetivas, como não considerar que as próprias pessoas com deficiência são capacitistas também? E talvez elas se reconheçam mais competentes e pertencentes em ambientes que não valorizam a hierarquia de habilidades. Que são ambientes geralmente separados. Então, como considerar o conceito de inclusão a partir das perspectivas capacitistas? Perspectivas capacitistas. Sem considerar. Não, como considerar o conceito de inclusão a partir das perspectivas capacitistas? Sorry.
I think it's a really important question. So when Justin presented our work, and he only touched on it very briefly because of the scope of it, but for the paper on exclusion, one of the things that we talk about is the ways and extent to which disabled children and young people, because that's the focus, can internalize ableism and the negative consequences of that as a form of oppression. You know, so what's quite interesting, I think, in our work and something that we're grappling with is there are times when we'll say to disabled children and young people, and if this doesn't address the question, please let me know. We'll say to disabled children and young people, what's your experience like? What do you want? What do you value? And what can and does happen is that they want and perpetuate ableist ideas themselves that arguably are not necessarily in their best interests. And ethically, I think that's very difficult to navigate, because we don't want to be in a position where we say, tell me what you want, and those children tell us what they want, and then we say, actually, that's not a good thing. You might not realize this, but you're re-perpetuating ableism. So it doesn't necessarily answer the question, but I think there's a real tension there between emphasizing and amplifying the voice of disabled children and young people, thinking about inclusion as intersubjective experiences, but also being mindful of the fact that those beliefs and those experiences may reinforce ableism. Yeah. Because how can they not? You know, ableism saturates culture. And I think that's one of the real difficulties that we have in that. You know, and again, I don't want to answer a question or address a question that I haven't been asked, but I think what we really need to do is explore the ways and extent to which ableism saturates the culture of schools, of sport, of education, and we need a holistic, whole school approach to trying to tackle it. We cannot just tackle it in physical education, because it manifests much more broadly than that. It comes from the school administrators, the school leaders, the teachers. It comes from parents at home. You know, it's everywhere. It's all encompassing. So it's a very, very difficult task. But I think by having too much of a narrow view just on PE and sport will not be successful. It needs to be much broader than that.
Sorry. And in addition to this, we have to fight against global ideas of sports. We see it in the television, and we see it in the media, and there is an underlying idea about a sport, and this idea is highly ableist. So, and we have to challenge this also. So it's, I don't know if we can succeed, but it's not. It does not end if we take an holistic approach to the school. It's a social approach. But in my mind, this is what I would call an inclusion approach.
Thank you.
Do you want to talk, Justin? Do you want to answer? Nobody's safe here, even you seated. We have questions for everyone. Ok. Alguém mais? Mais alguém? Não? Nenhuma pergunta? Tudo ok? Obrigado, Martin, for your lecture. Então, agora a gente tem a pausa para o almoço, tá? Eu sugiro, para quem não é daqui, a gente tem um restaurante próximo que dá para ir caminhando, chama Aulos, saindo da faculdade aqui, já na esquina. Tem almoço na cantina também, que eles têm prato feito, bem bacana. E é isso, 2 horas a gente está de volta, professor Sebastian. É isso aí. Obrigada, gente.